It was just a dropped pill, a tiny white tablet that slipped from my fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't my heart medication. It was chalky, brittle, and wrong. I took the fragments to the pharmacy, my hands trembling. The pharmacist looked at them under a magnifying glass and then looked at me with terror in his eyes. "Mrs. Callahan," he whispered, "this isn't heart medication. This is a lethal dose of beta blockers. Someone is trying to kill you." I realized then that my son and his wife weren't just trying to steal my house. They were trying to erase me. Martin, my pharmacist for 15 years, was still holding the phone, calling the police. The word hung between us like a toxic cloud. Murder. And suddenly, the forgotten memory slammed back into focus. 3 days after I got home from the hospital, 3 days after Bryce never showed up, Vanessa had appeared on my porch with grocery bags and a concerned smile. She had breezed past me with uninvited efficiency, claiming she felt terrible about Bryce missing the surgery and wanted to help. She had unpacked groceries I hadn't asked for, and then her eyes had landed on my medications lined up on the counter. 7 prescription bottles with hospital instructions. She had cooed with fake sympathy, telling me I couldn't possibly keep track of them all, and insisted on setting up a pill organizer for me, claiming she did it for her mother all the time. Before I could even register a protest, she had pulled a pair of latex gloves from her purse. She had laughed it off, claiming she had seasonal allergies and pollen made her hands break out. I remembered watching her sort my pills with quick clinical movements that felt almost too efficient, like she had practiced it. When she held up my heart medication, she had squinted at the label, glanced quickly at her phone, and then filled the Monday slots. She then snapped the organizer shut and leaned in close, her eyes wide with faux concern. "Don't skip any doses," she had said. "It's really important for your recovery." The ominous weight of those words finally hit me. She hadn't been ensuring my recovery. She must have been ensuring my expiration. She left 20 minutes later, taking her grocery bags, but leaving the latex gloves crumpled in my bathroom trash. Evidence she thought would be buried along with me. At the time, it seemed reasonable, a daughter-in-law trying to be helpful. But now, in the harsh light of the pharmacy, I realized the truth. If it was really about pollen allergies, why throw the gloves away inside my house instead of outside? Why wear them only for pill handling and nothing else? I had taken 1 dose the next morning. Within an hour, I had felt wrong, dizzy, weak, and my heartbeat sluggish like it was struggling through mud. I had blamed the surgery, blamed my age, and blamed the anesthesia leaving my system. I decided to wait before taking more, just to see how I felt. I had absolutely no idea that that moment of hesitation was the only thing that had saved me from a natural death in my sleep. Martin was still on the phone with the police. I sat in the pharmacy waiting chair, my hands shaking almost uncontrollably, staring at the tissue with the broken pill fragments. Martin sat beside me after the call, his voice gentle but urgent, asking if there was somewhere safe I could stay, and urging me not to go back to the house alone until the police figured out who did this. I thought about my house, the one I'd built with my husband 40 years ago, nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The house that my son and his wife were trying so hard to steal. I walked out to the parking lot, the bottle of poison heavy in my purse. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the sky feels low and heavy. I unlocked my car and tossed my bag onto the passenger seat. That was when I noticed a charcoal gray pickup truck parked 2 rows over. It was idling, with the exhaust puffing white smoke into the chill air. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe someone waiting for a prescription. I got in and started my engine. I adjusted my rearview mirror and my eyes snagged on that pickup truck again. It was no longer parked in a spot. It was now sitting diagonally across 2 lanes facing the exit. The driver was just a silhouette and perfectly still. A strange prickle of unease climbed up the back of my neck. I told myself I was being ridiculous. My nerves were probably just shot from the news Martin had just given me. I pulled out of my spot, and immediately the truck's brake lights flared and pulled out right behind me, cutting off a silver coupe just to stay on my bumper. My hands tightened on the wheel. Coincidence, I whispered. Just a coincidence. I took a sudden right turn down a side street, engaging my turn signal only at the very last second. The pickup swerved to follow me, tires chirping on the asphalt, the heavy engine roaring as it closed the gap. I floored it, shooting through a yellow light just as it turned red. The truck slammed on its brakes, trapped at the intersection behind cross traffic. I watched in the rearview mirror as it shrank into the distance, still idling there, and watching me go. The breath trapped in my lungs released in a jagged sob. I wasn't just a patient anymore. I was a loose end, and I drove the rest of the way home, checking the mirror every 3 seconds, convinced that every shadow was a predator closing in. I already knew who could be responsible. The only mystery left was the motive. To understand the pill better, I had to look back at the cancer. The diagnosis had come 6 months earlier, a stage 2 confirmation that required aggressive surgery. I remembered calling Bryce immediately, my hand trembling on the receiver. He had answered on the 3rd ring, his tone sharp with distraction. "Mom, what's up?" he said. "I'm in the middle of something." "I have cancer," I said, forcing the words out. "Breast cancer. I need surgery." There was a silence on the line that lasted too long. "Are you sure?" he asked finally. "Let me talk to Vanessa. We'll figure it out." He didn't call back that day. Or the next. 3 days later, Vanessa texted me saying she was sorry to hear about the diagnosis and sending positive vibes with a heart emoji. That was the extent of their support while my body was preparing for war. The surgery was finally scheduled for December 2nd. I asked Bryce if he could come, just to be there when I woke up. He said he'd try, but work was crazy. On the morning of the surgery, I called him one more time from the pre-op room. I was wearing a hospital gown that opened in the back, an IV already in my arm, needing to hear his voice before the anesthesia took me under. "Bryce," I whispered, "I'm scared." "You're tough, Mom," he said, his voice rushing to get off the line. "You'll be fine. I gotta go. I have a big meeting. Love you." And the line went dead. I called 5 more times that day. Voicemail. Voicemail and voicemail, and that's how I ended up waking up alone and deserted. How I ended up texting my neighbor Bridget for a ride home, and how I ended up vulnerable enough for Vanessa to walk into my kitchen with latex gloves and fake concern. But what I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until I broke into my son's digital life weeks later, was that this had been the plan all along. While I was in surgery, Bryce hadn't been in a meeting. He had been sending emails to real estate agents in Asheville with the subject line, "Timeline Update," and body text, "Mother just had surgery. Recovery period estimated 4 to 6 weeks, moving forward with the next phase." He'd been using my cancer as a timeline marker and a countdown clock to stealing my house. 3 weeks after Bridget drove me home, Vanessa came visiting again. This time, she wasn't alone. The living room suddenly felt smaller as Vanessa's perfume cut through the familiar smell of lemon polish and aged wood. I watched her eyes sweep across the room with appraisal, calculating square footage and estimating resale value. Bryce shifted his weight near the fireplace. For just a heartbeat, his gaze flickered toward me, and I saw something there. Terror, maybe, or profound shame. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by whatever hold Vanessa had on him. Vanessa's manicured nail tapped the screen of her tablet as she talked about moving companies, about retirement facilities with awesome activities, prepared meals, and nurses available all round the clock. She spoke about how much happier I'd be there. Happier. The word landed like a knife between my ribs. I told them quietly that I hadn't agreed to move, but Vanessa's smile barely flickered. She told me they were just helping me to understand my options, though her tone made it clear there were really no options, only inevitabilities. When Bryce finally spoke, his voice was rough and unfamiliar, reciting a rehearsed speech about the house being too overwhelming and the stairs being a hazard. I looked at him, searching for the son I raised, but found only a man terrified of his wife. When I refused to capitulate, Vanessa's mask slipped completely. She checked her watch and looked at me with ice in her eyes. "Thursday is concluded," she said. "The movers are already scheduled." She said it as if I were already a piece of furniture to be put in storage. They left soon after, with Vanessa's heels clicking a triumphant and impatient rhythm across the hardwood. Bryce paused at the door and turned as if to utter a desperate plea, then thought better of it. The door closed, and the house exhaled slowly. Afterwards, I walked to my bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, moved aside old sweaters, and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were documents I'd been gathering for weeks: property records, phone transcripts, bank statements, the routine evidence, and something that had made my blood freeze: the emails. The envelope had arrived 2 nights ago, thick, unmarked, and shoved deep into my mailbox. Not a professional delivery. There was something frantic about it. Inside were printed emails on company paper, bound with a single trembling handwritten note. "The truth must be told. This is confidential." I'd opened it immediately that night, sat at this very kitchen table, and read every word in mounting disbelief. Each email felt like a punch to the gut. Each timestamp proved premeditation, and each line revealed a son I no longer recognized. I'd hidden the evidence in this drawer, needing time to process the enormity of the betrayal. Now, standing here after their ultimatum, after Vanessa's cold decree and Bryce's cowardice, I pulled it out again, needing to see the proof with fresh and furious eyes. The first email was dated 8 months ago. 8 months. 2 full months before my cancer diagnosis. The subject was property inquiry, 847 Mountain Laurel Road. Bryce had written to a real estate agent, "I'm inquiring about a property valuation for my mother's home. She's getting older and may need to sell in the near future. I'd like to know what it's worth in the current market. Please keep this confidential." The agent had responded with a detailed analysis. Projected value, $1.2 million. My hands shook as I read the next email, dated 1 month later. "Thank you for the analysis. Timeline is still uncertain, but likely within 6 to 12 months. We'll be in touch when the situation develops. Again, please keep this confidential from the current owner." Confidential from the current owner, meaning confidential from me, his mother. However, the timeline of their cruelty was about to escalate. The third email was dated 1 week after my mastectomy. The subject was timeline update. Mother had surgery last week. Recovery period estimated 4 to 6 weeks. Moving forward with the next phase of the plan. We'll need recommendations for facilities that can provide documentation for cognitive assessments, and we'll need a clean paper trail for competency concerns. I read that line 5 times. Each time, the words carved deeper into my resolve. Cognitive assessment, competency concerns, paper trail. He'd been planning to declare me incompetent before I'd even healed from cancer. This wasn't desperation. This was a calculated operation with phases and timelines. I was a project, a problem to be solved, an obstacle between my son and $1.2 million. The final email was dated 2 weeks before the ultimatum, and the subject was ready to proceed. All pieces in place. I have facility recommendations, prepared witness statements, and a moving company on standby. Will execute on Thursday, April 15th. Was advised by counsel that swift action is best. Less time for complications. I was still reading when the distinct and metallic scratch of a key sliding into the front door lock froze my blood. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked at the clock on the microwave. 10:15 p.m. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I scrambled to gather the papers, my fingers fumbling with the slick pages. The lock tumbled. The heavy deadbolt slid back with a thud that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. I shoved the emails under a stack of placemats and set my teacup on top of them just as the front door swung open. It was Bryce. He hadn't knocked, and he hadn't called. He stopped in the hallway, blinking against the kitchen light, surprised to see me sitting up. "Mom? Why are you sitting in the dark?" I forced my heart to slow down and my hands to stop shaking. I had to look like a tired, confused old woman staring at the wall, not a mother holding the evidence of her son's betrayal. "I couldn't sleep," I rasped, pitching my voice to sound frail. "Who's there?" He bought the act and seemed to relax visibly. "Just me, Mom. I realized I left my sunglasses here earlier." He was lying. I could see his sunglasses perched on top of his head. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the room, not looking for glasses, perhaps checking for packed boxes or resistance. He walked right past the table where the evidence of his conspiracy was hidden under a thin layer of woven cotton and paused next to me, his hand resting on the back of my chair. For a second, I thought he was going to touch my shoulder, but he just gripped the wood. "Go to bed, Mom," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You have a big day on Thursday." He left as quickly as he came, and as the door clicked shut, I let out a breath that sounded like a sob. They weren't just waiting for me to move. They were doing wellness checks on their victim as well. I didn't move until I heard his engine fade down the mountain. Then I engaged the deadbolt, my fingers trembling on the cold metal. I walked back to the table and lifted the placemat, retrieving the documents I had hidden just seconds before. I smoothed the crinkled pages and spread them out again. They weren't just correspondence anymore. They were evidences of conspiracy, premeditation, and of a son who had been hunting his own mother for months while pretending to care about her recovery. The anonymous sender had included one more thing in the envelope, a screenshot of Bryce's browser history from his work laptop. The searches told their own chilling story, a digital trail of his intent that couldn't be explained away as concern. I read the search terms, each one a betrayal of the son I raised. How to sell parents' house without consent. Quickest way to liquidate estate assets. Power of attorney for real estate transactions. And average life expectancy stage 2 breast cancer. Each search was dated and time-stamped, undeniable proof that while I was worrying about biopsy results, my son was researching how to legally steal my life. I thought about all the visits over the past months, the casual questions about my health, whether I was forgetting things or feeling confused sometimes. He hadn't been worried about me. He had just been building a case. Every conversation had been an interview, and every question a trap designed to gather ammunition for a competency hearing. I carefully gathered the emails and added them to the growing pile of evidence in my dresser drawer. Already, I had evidence of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy, and now I had evidence of a plot to strip me of my autonomy. That night, I called the only person I could trust, Lawson Hale, my attorney. He had been my husband's lawyer for 30 years, a man who valued loyalty over billable hours. He listened to everything, his silence on the line heavy with anger, and then he said 5 words that changed the trajectory of the war. "I know someone who can help." A moment later, his text came through confirming the appointment. Derek Webb, tomorrow at 9 a.m. But before the investigator arrived, I had my own digging to do. The weapons for this fight hadn't all come from anonymous sources. There was something else, something I had found just 2 days ago, hidden in my late husband's old filing cabinet. It was a legal trust, ironclad, and designed to protect this house from exactly the kind of predation Bryce and Vanessa were attempting. I traced the edge of the document with my finger, feeling the weight of Gerald's protection even from beyond the grave. Then I pulled out a second folder, marked in his handwriting, for Bryce. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have bothered opening it because there was no need, but the time for secrets was over. The seal broke with a soft, hesitant tear. Inside was a letter dated 1 week before Gerald died. The letter warned Bryce that if he was reading this, it meant that his mother was probably in danger and urged him to protect me, warning him that if he failed, he would lose more than the house. He would lose himself. I pressed the letter against my chest, my eyes burning with tears, realizing that Gerald had known our son's weakness long before I was willing to admit it. My phone buzzed on the table, shattering the moment. It was Vanessa, confirming the movers for Thursday at 9 a.m. with a string of cheerful emojis and exclamation points, a galling performance of helpfulness masking the theft she was orchestrating. I immediately opened my contacts and scrolled to Lawson Hale and typed a single message. I found the trust. I'm ready. His response came within minutes. Good. Then we have everything we need. The war starts tomorrow. Outside, the evening light had turned the Blue Ridge Mountains purple and deep. I made myself some tea, sat at the kitchen table where I'd fed Bryce breakfast for 18 years, and began to plan. Thursday was just 3 days away, but by then, everything would be different. Now, alone in the pre-dawn quiet, I spread all the documents across the surface of the kitchen table like cards in a terrible game. That kitchen table had been there since Bryce was 3 years old. I could still see the crayon marks he'd carved into one leg, too deep to sand out. My laptop glowed as the search continued and browser tabs multiplied. I dove into public property records, archives from the Charlotte Observer, and social media profiles. Information that Vanessa thought was hidden, but was publicly available if you knew where to look. What I found made my stomach turn. Bryce and Vanessa's rental property in Charleston was drowning. They were 3 months behind on payments, and foreclosure proceedings had already been initiated. The house in Charlotte had a second mortgage taken out 8 months ago, the money from which seemed to have disappeared into thin air. But of course, I had seen the Instagram posts. A trip to Bali in March, a vacation in Paris in June, Bryce wearing a watch that cost more than my chemotherapy copays, and the $180,000 bonus Bryce's company gave him last year. Their joint checking account now showed a balance of only $11,000. I clicked through more tabs, uncovering casino transactions, cryptocurrency losses, and debts to private lenders with interest rates that made bile rise in my throat. Bryce wasn't just broke, he was drowning seriously. And instead of asking for help, he had decided to sacrifice me to stay afloat. The next morning, my phone buzzed at exactly 6 a.m. It was Bridget asking if I was okay after seeing my lights on all night. I asked her to come over. She arrived 10 minutes later, still in her bathrobe, her face pale with worry. She had been my anchor through the cancer treatments, driving me to appointments, sitting with me through the worst days, and never once making me feel like a burden. I told her everything: the ultimatum, the movers, the trust my husband had left, the money trail, the lies, and the calculated plan to remove me from my own life. Bridget's hand flew to her mouth, the shock evident on her face. I told her not to be sorry, that I would rather she be angry instead. She shot back that she was furious. Good, I replied, because I need your help. Her expression darkened, shifting from anger to a fearful hesitation. She told me slowly that there was something else Bryce had done, something she hadn't wanted to burden me with while I was recovering. My stomach dropped at her tone. What do you mean? She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, and explained that her husband, Frank, had wanted to tell me immediately, but she had thought they should wait until I was stronger. But now, seeing the full scope of the betrayal, she knew I needed to know everything now. She pressed play. Bryce's voice filled my kitchen, crystal clear and insidious. In the background of the recording, The familiar sounds of Bridget's front porch wind chimes tinkled softly. I heard my son sounding casual and almost reasonable as he suggested to Bridget that she must have noticed I had been confused lately, mentioning little things like forgetting names or leaving the stove on. Bridget's voice cut through the recording, flat and hard, denying it instantly. Bryce pushed harder, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. He told her to come on, that she saw me every day, and that 63 was about the age when all these forgetfulness and confusion started. Bridget defended me, telling him I was sharp as a tack. There was a brief pause on the recording, and then Bryce continued, claiming he was trying to protect me from myself. He explained that competency hearings needed witnesses, and that neighbor testimony carried weight. He told her all he needed was for her to tell the court that she had seen some concerning behavior. That was all. "You want me to lie?" Bridget asked, her voice shocked. "I want you to help me protect my mother," Bryce had answered, using the language of care to mask his crime. "This is bullshit," Bridget exploded. There was another uncomfortable pause before Bryce spoke again. This time his voice had changed. He sounded desperate. $5,000, he said. "Cash, just for 5 minutes of testimony." "Get off my porch," Bridget ordered, her voice shaking with fury. $10,000, Bryce persisted. $10,000, Bridget. You and Frank could use it, right? "I said get out," she screamed. I heard footsteps, a door slamming, and then silence. The recording ended. I sat frozen, broken, and betrayed. My son had gone from door to door in my own neighborhood, offering my friends $10,000 to lie about me in court just to help him steal my house, my freedom, and my life. I whispered, asking when this happened. Bridget replied that it was about 2 weeks before they came to me with the ultimatum. She added that it wasn't just her. He had tried the same thing with the Hendersons down the street, the Smiths, and even Pastor Mike from the church. He had been canvassing the neighborhood like a politician, trying to buy enough votes to lock me away. I asked why she didn't tell me sooner. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she explained that I was recovering from cancer, that I was so weak, and she didn't want to add more stress. She admitted she had hoped he would come to his senses. "But he didn't," I said, the reality settling in. I asked if I could have the recording. Bridget told me it was already on a flash drive she had brought with her. She handed it to me, emphasizing that this was witness tampering and conspiracy to commit fraud. I took the drive, feeling its weight. It was evidence. After Bridget left, I sat there gripping the small device, my mind racing. The thought of Bryce going from door to door, offering money for false testimony against his mother, was revolting. But it was also comforting to know that I had neighbors who loved me more than they needed his money. I added the flash drive to my evidence drawer, which was steadily filling up. Emails proving premeditation, browser history revealing his research, recordings of bribery, and medical evidence of attempted murder. I was building a fortress of proof. 2 hours later, the doorbell rang again. It wasn't a neighbor this time. It was Derek Webb, the private investigator Lawson had promised to send. He sat at my kitchen table, a man who looked like he had seen too much darkness to be surprised by family betrayal. I pushed the entire pile toward him. The emails, the browser history, the financial spreadsheet I had compiled overnight, and the flash drive Bridget had just given me. He went through it all in silence, his expression hardening with every page. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes serious. "Mrs. Callahan," he said quietly, "we have enough here to prove fraud. But I need to warn you, if I dig deeper into Vanessa, things are going to get worse before they get better." "Dig," I said. He nodded and left. And he was right. When Derek returned the following day, the look on his face told me the news was catastrophic. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and warned me that what he was about to show me was disturbing. I told him to go ahead. He opened his laptop and slid it towards me. It was Vanessa's browser history, pulled from her personal laptop. It started as far back as September 12th, 2 months before my cancer diagnosis. I scrolled down and saw the searches: how to prove elderly parent incompetent in North Carolina, and memory care facilities Asheville reviews. Obviously, she had begun planning this long before I even became sick. Fast forward to October 29th. There it was. Her search history revealing queries about medications that cause confusion in the elderly and drug interactions that cause memory problems. It hit me hard that she was researching ways to induce the very confusion Bryce was claiming I had. Then, just 3 days after my diagnosis on November 15th, I saw searches for life expectancy breast cancer stage 2 and estate transfer before death versus after death taxes. She wasn't just planning, she was calculating the actuarial odds of my survival. But what came next was the most chilling of all. December 2nd, the day of my mastectomy, I spotted searches for phrases like fatal dose propranolol, beta blocker overdose symptoms, and do they autopsy elderly deaths at home? It felt like a physical punch to the gut. While I was in surgery, fighting for my life, my daughter-in-law was researching how to end it. The investigator continued to scroll down, revealing even more from that day. How long does beta blocker overdose take to kill? And then came the real kicker: Amazon orders delivered to her office to keep them hidden. They included a professional pill crusher, a digital scale, empty gelatin capsules, and a box of latex gloves. All ordered between December 3rd and December 8th. The impact fully dawned on me. I realized she had been making her own pills, grinding up beta blockers, measuring lethal doses, and filling capsules to look identical to my prescription. The investigator confirmed my realization. If I hadn't dropped that pill, I would have been dead by now. December 10th, 2 days before Vanessa came to help, she had been searching for do latex gloves leave fingerprints and how to dispose of evidence medication tampering. I sat back, my mind reeling. This wasn't opportunistic. This was a research project, a murder plot built like a term paper. I asked if Bryce knew about this. The investigator shook his head, explaining that the laptop belonged to Vanessa and was password protected. The credit card was in her name only, and the Amazon account used her work address. She had kept these preparations completely separate. So while Bryce was planning to declare me incompetent and steal my house, his wife was planning a parallel operation to murder me. His crime was theft. Hers was homicide. I told Derek I needed copies of everything. He handed me 2 flash drives, organized by category. Drive 1 contained the attempted murder evidence, while Drive 2 contained something else. Something he said would change everything I thought I knew about my family dynamics. He asked what I wanted to do with the drives. I looked at the small metal devices that held the proof of my intended execution, and I pictured Vanessa researching my death like a project manager on a mission. I'm giving it to the police, I said firmly. All of it. Derek nodded, telling me it was wise because what she planned was attempted first-degree murder. She wouldn't just get fraud charges, she would get murder charges. Good, I said, and I meant it, because some people don't deserve mercy. Vanessa had researched my death like homework, and now I was going to make sure she spent years behind bars researching how she destroyed her own life. The silence in the kitchen following the investigator's revelation about the pills was heavy. Derek closed his laptop, his face grim. We have the weapon, he said, standing up. Now I need the motive. I'm going to run a forensic sweep on her financials. If she's killing for money, there will be a paper trail. I'll call you the second I find it. He left, the front door clicking shut behind him. I tried to keep myself busy for the next few hours. I cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, and watched the sun slowly drag itself toward the horizon. By the time twilight settled over the mountains, the shadows in the house had grown long and deep. It was nearly 8 p.m. when I finally reached for the landline to call Bridget. But there was no dial tone, just dead air. I frowned and checked my cell phone. No service. That was impossible. I always had full bars in the kitchen. I walked to the window and peered out into the twilight. That's when I saw it. The utility box on the side of the house was open. A figure was standing there, illuminated by the glow of a flashlight. It was a man dressed entirely in black, a hood pulled low over his face to obscure his features. I couldn't tell who it was, but I could see what he was holding. A pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. He raised them and clamped down. With a sharp snap, he severed the cable. Inside the kitchen, the lights on my Wi-Fi router blinked out, plunging the house into digital silence. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was an invasion. Someone was actively isolating me and cutting the lines to ensure no signal could get in or out. They were turning my home into a cage. I watched him latch the box and walk back to a charcoal gray pickup truck, parked just down the road with the lights off. He wasn't leaving. He was just sitting there, watching. I realized then that I couldn't wait until morning. If I stayed here tonight, cut off from the world, I might never leave. I grabbed my purse, the flash drives, and my keys. I didn't use the front door. I slipped out the back, crawling through the hedges to Bridget's yard, my heart hammering against my ribs. I borrowed Bridget's car and drove until I hit the main road. As soon as I got a signal, my phone rang. It was Derek. "Mrs. Callahan, are you safe?" he asked, his voice urgent. I think so," I stammered. "I just left the house. They cut the lines." "Good. Keep driving," he said, "because I found the money, and it changes everything." I pulled over to the shoulder of the road, my hands shaking on the wheel. "She's not just stealing from you," Derek said. "She's been siphoning money from Bryce's business accounts for 18 months, offshore accounts, shell companies. The realization hit me harder than the fear. You mean she's stealing from him while he's stealing from me?" "It's a double cross," Derek confirmed. "She manufactures the pressure on Bryce to make him desperate enough to want to kill you. Then she takes the inheritance, divorces him, and leaves him to take the fall. She's playing you both." "And Helen? Brace yourself. To crown it all, I found surveillance photos. She's having an affair with Bryce's boss." The phone suddenly slipped from my hand, slick with sweat. I pulled over to the shoulder, my hazard lights blinking in the darkness, and just breathed. It wasn't grief I felt. It was nausea. The sheer scale of her cruelty was breathtaking. She wasn't just trying to kill me. She was methodically erasing my son's entire existence while sleeping with the man who signed his paychecks. For a fleeting second, I wanted to call Bryce. I wanted to scream the truth at him, to break the spell she had cast. But I stopped my thumb over his contact name. If I told him now, he'd panic. He'd confront her, and she would talk her way out of it like she always did. He needed to see it in handcuffs. I dialed Detective Reyes instead. "I'm coming in," I told her, "and I'm bringing the rest of the puzzle." She didn't ask for details. "Get to the station," she ordered. Now, I sat in the interrogation room, the fluorescent lights humming a low, headache-inducing buzz that brought me back to the hospital recovery room where this nightmare had begun. Detective Reyes sat across from me, her face grim as she listened to the recording of my son trying to bribe my neighbor. Beside her, Derek, the private investigator, looked like a man who had just laid down a royal flush. We had the pills, we had the browser history, we had the motive. But Detective Reyes wasn't celebrating yet. She leaned forward, clasping her hands on the cold metal table, and told me the hard truth about the justice system. She explained that while the evidence was strong, a high-priced defense lawyer, the kind Vanessa would undoubtedly hire with money siphoned from Bryce, could spin it. They could claim the browser history was for a crime novel she was writing, or that the pills were a manufacturing error from the source. To get a conviction that would put her away for life, to ensure she never hurt anyone else, we needed something undeniable. We needed intent. We needed a confession captured in real time. She asked me if I was willing to do something dangerous. She asked if I was willing to be the bait. I didn't hesitate. I thought about the latex gloves and about the heart emoji sent while I was in surgery. I told her I would do whatever it took. The plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. I had to go back home. I had to pretend I had taken the pills. I had to play the role of the dying, confused old woman they wanted me to be, and I had to invite them over to sign the papers. The house would be wired for sound and video. Police would be in a van down the street. But for the duration of the performance, I would be in the room with them, alone. I drove home that afternoon with a team of plainclothes technicians following in an unmarked van. They spent 3 hours turning my home into a surveillance trap. They installed pinhole cameras in the crown molding of the living room, disguised as imperfections in the paint. They taped a microscopic microphone to the underside of the kitchen island and another beneath the coffee table. They taught me the safe word, a phrase I could scream if things went sideways and I needed them to breach the door immediately. When they left, the silence that settled over the house was heavy and suffocating. I was no longer living in a home. I was living on a stage set designed for a tragedy. I waited until 7 p.m., the time I knew Vanessa would be home from her yoga studio, likely pouring her first glass of wine to celebrate her cleverness. I picked up the phone. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from a cold, simmering rage that I had to tamp down into a performance of weakness. I dialed Bryce's number. He answered on the second ring. When I spoke, I pitched my voice an octave higher, adding a breathless and confused rasp that I had heard so many patients use in their final days. I told him I wasn't feeling well, that I was dizzy, my heart felt funny, and I was scared. He asked immediately if I had taken the pills Vanessa gave me. There was no concern in his voice, only a sharp and predatory alertness. I lied. I told him yes, that I took them every day, just like she said, but that I felt they were making me worse. I told him I thought I needed a doctor. He panicked, barking at me not to call a doctor, then softening his tone instantly to a soothing, manipulative purr. He told me I was just recovering, that it was normal to feel weak, and that I probably just needed to rest more. I let out a long and shuddering breath into the receiver, acting the part of the defeated mother. I told him I didn't want to be alone anymore. I told him he was right. The house was too much, the stairs were too hard, and I couldn't do it anymore. I'm ready to sign, I whispered. There was a silence on the line. I could almost hear him smiling. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment the obstacle removed itself. We'll be there tomorrow morning, he said eagerly. By 9 a.m., he hung up, eager to claim his inheritance, unaware he had just scheduled his own arrest. The next morning, the stage was set. I didn't wear makeup. I pulled my hair back into a messy, loose bun, letting the gray strands fly free to mimic neglect. I put on an old, oversized cardigan that made me look smaller and frailer, like I was shrinking inside my own clothes. I even practiced shuffling when I walked, adopting the gait of a woman whose heart was failing. At 8:55 a.m., a black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the driveway. I watched from behind the curtain as Vanessa stepped out. She looked radiant, glowing with health and victory, holding a Starbucks cup in one hand and a leather folder in the other. Bryce followed her, looking pale and nervous, adjusting his tie as if he were walking into a funeral. They didn't knock. They used the key I had given Bryce years ago, a key I hadn't changed because I wanted them to feel comfortable. I wanted them arrogant. They found me sitting in the armchair in the living room, a blanket draped over my legs to hide the fact that I wasn't trembling. Vanessa dropped into a squat beside my chair, the scent of her expensive perfume nauseatingly strong in the closed room. "Have you been taking your medicine?" she cooed. "Yes," I lied, looking her in the eye. "But it hurts, Vanessa. My chest feels like it's caving in. She smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. She reached out and patted my hand. Her touch was cold. That just means it's working, sweetie. You have to push through it. Bryce stood near the window, unable to look at me, and staring out at the garden I would never let him inherit. I told them I felt like I was dying, and I was tired of fighting. Vanessa stood up, brisk and businesslike. She unzipped the leather folder and told me that was why they were here, to let me rest. She laid the documents on the coffee table. It wasn't a standard real estate listing agreement. It was a quitclaim deed and a power of attorney. They weren't helping me sell the house. They were asking me to sign it over to them for $1. I looked at the papers, then at the pen she was holding out to me, and I squinted, feigning confusion. Then I told her I couldn't read the fine print because my eyes were blurry. Vanessa's patience snapped, and her voice tightened with impatience as she told me it just said what we discussed, that it gave Bryce the power to handle my affairs so I could focus on getting better. I dropped the rasp, sat up straight, letting the blanket fall, and looked her dead in the eye. I spoke slowly, letting my natural, strong voice fill the room. I asked her if the papers were to help me get better or if they were to make sure she got the house before the pills finished the job. The room went deathly still. The air pressure dropped. Vanessa's smile froze in place. She didn't gasp. She didn't deny it. She went perfectly still, like a predator spotting a threat. Her eyes flicked to Bryce, then back to me. The mask of the concerned daughter-in-law evaporated, revealing the cold, calculating stranger underneath. She didn't deny it. Instead, she laughed, a short, sharp bark of disdain. "Cancer takes too long," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "And you're too stubborn to die. We didn't have years, Helen. We had months." She revealed that the foreclosure notice on their Charleston property had come last week, and they needed the cash now. "So you decided to murder me?" I asked. "It was a mercy," she spat. "You're old, you're sick, and we needed the cash now." I looked at her, feeling a strange cold pity. "That's the tragedy of it, Vanessa. You did all that research on poisons, but you didn't research the deed." She frowned. "What?" "Gerald put this house in an irrevocable trust before he died," I said, my voice steady. "I found the papers a few days ago. Even if I signed that quitclaim, even if I died tonight, the house doesn't go to Bryce. It locks down for 10 years. You would have killed me for a paycheck that doesn't exist." Vanessa's face went gray. The realization hit her. She hadn't just committed a crime. She had committed a mistake. "You're lying," she whispered. "I'm not," I said. "And the police who are listening to this conversation know it too." When I mentioned the police, she froze. Her eyes darted around the room, scanned the ceiling, scanned the table, then landed on the smoke detector, where a tiny red light, one that hadn't been there yesterday, was blinking steadily. She lunged. It happened in a blur. She grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the end table, her face twisted into a mask of pure hate, and swung it toward me. "Police," I screamed, the safe word useless in the face of immediate violence. The front door exploded inward. It didn't open. It shattered. Men in tactical gear poured into the hallway like a dark tide. Vanessa froze with the lamp raised above her head, looking like a statue of vengeance, before the reality of the guns leveled at her chest forced her to drop it. The lamp crashed to the floor, a deafening clang that signaled the end of her life as she knew it. Bryce was already on his knees, sobbing, his hands behind his head, mouthing the word "Mom" over and over. I didn't look at him. I looked at Vanessa as they slammed her against the wall and cuffed her. "You were right about one thing," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos. "I am stubborn, too stubborn to die for your debt." They dragged them out. The house filled with the squawk of radios and the tramp of boots. But as the adrenaline faded and the officers began to bag the evidence, I realized that the coldness in the room hadn't left with Vanessa. It had settled in my bones. I had survived the trap. But looking at the shattered door and the overturned lamp, I knew that the home I had built was gone. It was a crime scene now, and I was the only witness left standing. The silence that followed the raid was absolute. The police had taken the hard drives, the pills, the lamp Vanessa had thrown, and finally, they had taken my son and his wife. I stood in the hallway, looking at the splintered wood of my front door frame, the physical scar of the violence that had just occurred. I didn't call a carpenter. I didn't call Bridget. I simply walked into the kitchen, poured the cold tea down the sink, and washed the mug. I was alone again, but this time, the solitude didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like safety. 2 days later, the call came from Detective Reyes. Her voice was tight and vibrating with a grim professional satisfaction that told me the news was worse than I expected. She informed me that they had formally charged them both. Bryce was facing conspiracy and fraud. Vanessa was facing attempted first-degree murder. I told her I knew. I was there. But she told me there was more. She explained that when they executed the search warrant on Vanessa's yoga studio, they found a burner phone taped under a drawer in her office. They had cracked it that morning. I sat down, gripping the phone. Reyes told me that it wasn't just research about me. She told me Vanessa had been communicating with a private investigator she hired 5 years ago. She wasn't investigating a spouse. She was investigating toxicology reports. Specifically, how to make cardiac arrest look natural. My blood ran cold. Reyes explained that Vanessa's first husband had died 7 years ago. He was 42, a triathlete. He dropped dead of a massive coronary in his sleep. His life insurance payout was $2 million. That was the money she used to start her business. That was the money she used to buy the clothes she wore to court my son. I closed my eyes as the room started spinning slightly. Vanessa wasn't just a greedy daughter-in-law. She was a serial predator who had been perfecting her craft for a decade. My cancer hadn't been a tragedy to her. It had been an opportunity to refine a methodology she had already perfected. Reyes told me they were reopening the case on her first husband. They were requesting an exhumation order and Temund. She promised me that Vanessa wasn't getting out on bail. She was going to die in prison. I hung up the phone, feeling a strange, hollow horror. My son hadn't just married a thief. He had been sleeping next to a monster. The next day, Derek Webb, the investigator, returned to my kitchen. He looked tired, but he carried a thick manila envelope that looked heavy with secrets. He told me the police had the murder evidence, but I needed to see this. This was the leverage that would save my son, or at least save his soul. I opened the folder. It was a forensic accounting of Bryce and Vanessa's joint finances, along with the surveillance photos. Derek pointed to a column of red numbers. He explained that Vanessa wasn't just killing me for the inheritance. She was planning to leave Bryce the day the check cleared. He showed me an offshore account in Cook Islands in her maiden name. She had been siphoning money from Bryce's business accounts for 18 months and had stolen over $300,000 from him. I stared at the transfers. While Bryce was panicking about debts, drowning in anxiety, and begging me for money, his wife had been busy robbing him blind. Then Derek tapped a photo. It was a grainy image taken from a distance of Vanessa, sitting at a cafe and holding hands with a man I didn't recognize. Derek identified him as Bryce's boss. He explained they had been having an affair for over a year now. The boss had been feeding her information about Bryce's performance and helping her gaslight him into thinking he was about to be fired. She had manufactured the pressure cooker and made Bryce feel like he was drowning so he would reach for my life preserver, my house. She had played him just as hard as she had played me. I looked at the photo of the woman who had tried to kill me, smiling at another man while spending my son's money. I asked if Bryce was now aware. Derek shook his head and explained that Bryce was sitting in a cell right now, still thinking he was protecting his wife and was refusing to cut a deal because he thought they were in this together. I stood up, picked up the folder, and told him I needed to visit the jail. The visiting room at the county detention center was a box of gray cinder blocks and bulletproof glass. It smelled of industrial cleaner and despair, and sat on the metal stool with my hands folded on the ledge, waiting. When they brought Bryce in, he looked like a ghost. His orange jumpsuit hung off his frame, and his face was gray with exhaustion. He sat down, but he wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, his shoulders hunched in shame. I told him softly that I wasn't there to yell at him. He flinched, mumbling that I should, that he deserved it. I told him he deserved to know the truth. I pressed the folder against the glass and told him Vanessa didn't do this for us. She didn't do it for the family. He tried to defend her, mumbling about mistakes and desperation, but I cut him off and told him she had been stealing from him and that she had already stolen $300,000 from his business accounts. I also told him about the account in the Cook Islands. His head snapped up, and he argued that it was impossible that they were broke. I corrected him. You are broke, Bryce. She is rich. I turned the page against the glass to show him the photo of Vanessa and his boss, and that she had been sleeping with his boss for a year. I told him they had planned this together. She was going to kill me, take the house money, divorce him, and leave him with the debt and the guilt. I watched the realization hit him. It wasn't a sudden break. It was slow, agonizing, and crumbling. I watched his face shift from denial to confusion, and then to a grief so profound it was hard to witness. He realized that the woman he had destroyed his integrity for had despised him the entire time. He pressed his forehead against the glass, sobbing. I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry. I placed my hand on the glass opposite his. I know. He lifted his head. His eyes were red, but the fog was gone. There was a new hardness there, the hardness of a man who has nothing left to lose. I'll fix it, he whispered. I'll tell them everything. And he did. The next morning, Bryce requested a meeting with the district attorney. He didn't ask for a plea deal. He didn't ask for leniency. He simply sat down and spilled every secret. He testified about the pressure, the manipulation, and the timeline. He handed them the roadmap to Vanessa's psychological warfare. Because of his cooperation, his charges were reduced. But for Vanessa, the walls slammed shut. The trial was brief. It wasn't a drama. It was a slaughter. I sat in the back row as the prosecution laid out the case. They didn't need to be theatrical. They just put the Amazon receipts on the screen. Pill crusher, empty capsules, latex gloves. They showed the browser history, fatal dose beta blockers. Then they played the recording of her calling me a stubborn old bitch who wouldn't die fast enough. Vanessa didn't cry this time. She sat at the defense table, stone-faced, and watched her life disintegrate. She knew the performance was over. When the jury read the verdict, guilty on all counts, including attempted first-degree murder, she didn't even look at the judge. She looked at me. Her eyes were cold, like dead things. She mouthed something I couldn't read, but I didn't care to decipher it. I just looked away. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison. Bryce received 2 years in a minimum security facility with credit for time served. It was justice. But as I walked out of the courthouse, stepping into the blinding afternoon sun, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt heavy with the weight of the wreckage they had left behind. I drove home to the house on Mountain Laurel Road, walked through the rooms, listening to the echoes of 40 years of life. I looked at the kitchen table where I had planned my defense, and at the spot on the floor where I had dropped the pill that saved my life. That was when I realized that I couldn't stay. This house wasn't a home anymore. It had become a crime scene. Every corner held a memory of betrayal. The kitchen was where Vanessa had worn her gloves. The living room was where Bryce had tried to evict me, and Huguin. The front porch was where Bridget had been bribed. I had fought to keep this house, fought for the principle, not the structure, and fought to prove that I was still the author of my own life. And now, as the author, I decided it was time to turn the page. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday, piercing the manicured lawn I had tended for 4 decades. I watched from the window as the realtor hammered it into the earth, feeling a strange mixture of grief and relief. The house on Mountain Laurel Road had been my pride, a testament to my late husband's hard work and my own resilience. But now the walls whispered with the echoes of betrayal. The kitchen wasn't the heart of the home anymore. It had become the laboratory where my murder had been manufactured. The living room was no longer a gathering place. It was the stage where my son had tried to evict me. I could no longer walk down the hallway without seeing the phantom of Vanessa swinging that brass lamp. I didn't sell it to a developer or a flipper. I sold it to a young couple with a baby on the way, a pair of starry-eyed teachers who looked at the crown molding and saw a future, unaware of the history soaking into the floorboards. I signed the papers with a steady hand, converting the equity my son had tried to steal into a check that belonged solely to me. The move was swift. I hired a professional team, no family favors, and no helpful daughter-in-law to pack my life into boxes. I purged the memories that hurt too much to keep. The crayon-marked table stayed behind. The old photos of Bryce as a teenager, the ones I used to look at with such pride, went into a storage bin, sealed with duct tape, and placed at the very back of the moving truck. I bought a smaller place, a cottage near the Blue Ridge Parkway with a view of the mountains that felt cleaner and sharper. It had no stairs to fall down, no guest room for ungrateful children, and locks that I changed the day I moved in. 3 months after the sentencing, a letter arrived from the state penitentiary. It was from Bryce. I sat on my new porch, the cool mountain air smelling of pine and damp earth, and held the envelope. For a long time, I debated burning it unopened, but curiosity, or perhaps the last vestige of maternal instinct, won out. I slit the top. The letter was short. The handwriting was cramped and stripped of the corporate arrogance that had defined him for years. He wrote that the fog had finally lifted. He wrote that sitting in a cell, stripped of his suits and his status, he finally saw Vanessa for what she was, and more importantly, he saw himself. He apologized for the greed. He apologized for the silence in the hospital. And he apologized for the moment he stood in my living room and let his wife tell me to die. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for a visit. He just asked me to know that he was sorry. I folded the letter, but there was a second envelope in the stack, a stiff, cheap paper with no return address, just a postmark from the Women's Federal Penitentiary. My hands went cold. I slid it open. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper, no words, just a crude pencil drawing of a house engulfed in flames. At the bottom, written in jagged, angry strokes, was a date, 2046, her release year. She was still trying to haunt me, still trying to cast a shadow from inside her cage. I walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and held it to the corner of her drawing. I watched the paper curl and blacken, the threat turning to ash in my hearth. I put Bryce's letter back in its envelope. I didn't reach for a pen to write back. I wasn't ready to offer absolution, and I wasn't going to offer false hope. Instead, I called my attorney, Lawson Hale, and instructed him to activate the secondary clause in my husband's trust, a modest fund for rehabilitation and education that would be made available to Bryce only upon his release, and only if he completed a court-ordered ethics course. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't a house, but it was a ladder. If he wanted to climb out of the hole he had dug, he would have to do the climbing himself. As for Vanessa, that drawing was the last sound she made. After the prison authorities intercepted her attempt to smuggle out more threats, she was moved to solitary confinement. The silence that followed was total. There were no more letters, no appeals, only the cold reality of a 25-year sentence in a federal facility. She was a predator in a cage, stripping the paint off the walls because there was no one left to consume. I stood up and walked to the railing of my porch. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that didn't smell of medicine or fear. I was Helen Callahan. I was 64 years old. I had survived cancer. I had survived a poison plot. I had survived the heartbreak of a child's betrayal. They had tried to write the final chapter of my life. They had tried to close the book on me, to file me away as a tragedy or a statistic. But they forgot that as long as I was breathing, I was the one holding the pen. I took a sip of my tea, watching the first stars appear in the twilight. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of peace, and that was the best revenge of all. You've made it to the end. You walked through the fire with Helen. But I have to be honest, it breaks my heart when I see people listen to these stories, feel these heavy emotions, and then just walk away. No subscription, no support, just silence. It feels like I'm pouring my soul into a void, working days and nights to bring these voices to life, only to be met with ghost viewers. Please, don't be another ghost. If this story kept you company, don't just take it and leave. You owe it to the story to leave a mark. A subscribe, a super thanks, or even just commenting your city. Tell me where in the world you are listening from. Let me know exactly where my voice is traveling so I know I'm not alone in this. And if you aren't ready to leave yet, don't. There are 2 more real-life journeys right here on your screen. Pick one. Stay with me a little longer. Don't let the silence win. Until next time.